For the last few weeks, violence against Asians have filled the front pages, and horrific videos on social media captured the bruised faces, swollen eyes, and the sheer distress of shell-shocked victims who'd been assaulted simply for being of Asian descent. This wave of targeted violence has been on the rise since the COVID-19 outbreak early last year, which was first reported in China. The situation spiraled to the shooting of 8 people in Atlanta, Georgia by a white man last week, 6 of the victims being Asian American women. While President Joe Biden has condemned the killing spree as a hate crime, it hasn't been deemed as such officially, and many are now calling for tougher laws against hate crimes in general. But the situation is far from being settled. Discrimination and abuse still continues, not only in the United States, but also in Canada and a number of European countries as well. We take a look at this very disturbing trend of irrational intolerance towards people from Asian backgrounds and how to tackle this deeply rooted racism that has reached its boiling point. For this, I'm joined by Jonathan Choe, crime and justice reporter for KOMO News, and Dr. Wang, Associate Professor of Counselling Psychology at Santa Clara University. A very warm welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us on Arirang. And, well, very disturbing news that we've been hearing recently from your country, the United States. And, well, starting with you, Jonathan, the statistics show that crimes against Asian Americans have risen significantly throughout the US. How rampant is this violence right now?
It really depends where you live. It is quite staggering, depending on the statistics that you look at right now. According to Stop AAPI Hate, a nonprofit tracking this stuff, pretty much since the start of the pandemic, March of 2020, hate crimes against Asian Americans in the U.S., more than 3,800. And those are just the ones that have been reported. And we're really seeing these in some of the big epicenters for Asian American communities like San Francisco, New York City, and especially here in Seattle as well. We're seeing our fair share of hate crimes, and not just the crimes, but the harassment, the name calling, the racial slurs being hurled at Asian Americans. Pew Research put out this crazy number. Since the start of the pandemic, 3 in 10 Asian Americans have experienced some type of racism or racial slur thrown at them.
And that sounds really unbelievable to me, really, because I was in Seattle 2 years ago and it was a much different picture from the one you've just painted. And, well, you've spoken to victims of this wave of violence. Just how worried are Asian Americans right now in their own country?
Oh, yeah, it is absolutely fear. Maybe it hasn't happened to them, but there's the fear, the possibility of knowing it could happen to them, it could happen to their loved ones, especially older Asian Americans, grandmas, grandpas, their parents. That's what we're hearing. You go on social media, that's what everyone's concerned about. It seems like these perpetrators are targeting intentionally the weak, the marginalized, people who can't fight back. And in many cases, a lot of these Asian Americans, they don't speak English fluently. So in some ways, authorities out here, the police, they think they're being targeted too because they're not going to report it.
And how has it been for you as a reporter really covering this issue and seeing all this distress?
You know, my goodness, I don't know where to begin. I'm sort of speechless because I have to be honest with you. I haven't even had a chance to take time to take a deep breath and process. And I know I need to do that because I think for a lot of us in the business, journalists, especially Asian American journalists, it's taking a mental toll because at the end of the day, we're Asian Americans first, then journalists. Yet we have to cover this stuff. This is happening in our own communities, our own neighborhoods that we care about, and it's happening to our friends. It's happening to people that, again, who we know. And it may not be happening in our own backyard, but the Asian American community, especially among journalists, we all know each other. So we're hearing these stories in San Francisco. We're hearing the stories of my colleagues covering this up in New York City. And we're just baffled and we're wondering, when is it going to stop? This is a story we do not want to cover any longer.
And now, Dr. Choe, it's really one thing to dislike or hold bias against people from other ethnic backgrounds, but to actually bring that into action and, what do you think drives people to carry out acts of hate? And what do you think really fueled this aggression starting from last year?
Well, I'd be lying if I didn't say that, the previous president really played a significant role in the violence that's happening now. But racism is not new, right? Anti-Asian racism, anti-Asian sentiments themselves are not very new. But we did have a president who spewed anti-Chinese rhetoric, and that became anti-Asian rhetoric. And he really flamed and incited these words in ways that allowed people to permit whatever biases they already had, right? To then be able to say it out loud, to get attention, I would say even positive attention for it, to be celebrated for it, and then to really use it as hate speech. And I think not only is it that you can express those feelings, but then you can actually, what he role modeled was you can do it and there's no consequences. Right? You can say all these things. And so it really then allows people to take that next step and really act out whatever anxiety they have.
And Dr. Sherry, we saw from the very unfortunate killing of the 6 Asian American women in Georgia that, well, women have they've been particularly vulnerable to this. And do you think Asian Americans, especially those who are female, are seen as easy targets?
Absolutely. I mean, we see from the data, the Stop AAPI Hate, since March 2020 to now, that women are 2.3 times more likely to be targeted, and that women historically and continuously are targeted by violence, both from sexism and racism. And we have to understand that it's simultaneous. It's not one or the other when we think about the shootings. And white imperialism, plays a significant role when we think about what happened in this U.S. context, but it also bleeds into Western context, right? That with the American military being abroad, such as in the Philippine-American War, in World War II, and the Vietnam War, there's been a history of soliciting sex workers and Americans participating in sectors and industries that encouraged sex trafficking. And that then contributed to the stereotypes that we have of Asian women in Hollywood and in the media, being dehumanized, right, as sexual objects and not like human beings, like your mother, your sister, and your daughter. And so you add to this case the fetishization of Asian women, the hypersexualization of women, and then women working in the service sector where, they're already economically vulnerable in low-wage jobs. And so it really kind of culminates where, our society sees Asian women as disposable objects, right, meant to serve you. And so we know with COVID that Asian women have been disproportionately affected because of our work in the service sector. And so now if you think about all the women who work in service sector, there's going to be a fear to even go out to make the money to survive, right, and to help your family survive. So for women, Asian Americans in general, and for Asian American women specifically, there's a fear now of not just going out, but going to work, of having to be constantly vigilant and basically anticipating I may be attacked, I may be killed today. And the way to survive is to don't be Asian, don't look Asian, and don't look like a woman. And that's the way to be safe.
So really these stereotypes, they existed, of course, long before this flurry of racism fueled by COVID-19 came about last year. But really, Jonathan, the question is how it got so bad. There was a strong pattern of violence against Asian Americans emerging in parts of your country last year when the pandemic broke out. But, well, really, it does seem that the discrimination is more deeply rooted. But then what do you think really caused this escalation of hatred towards Asian Americans? And do you think that the authorities could have done more to prevent the situation from actually spiraling to this point?
Yeah, it's really hard to pinpoint just one particular reason. The professor talked about it already. We had a president named Donald Trump, and he kept referring to the coronavirus, COVID-19, as the Wuhan flu, the Wuhan virus, the China virus, Kung flu. And while he claimed that he simply was referencing the origin of the virus, what that did is, especially to many of his supporters, many of the white supremacists out there, the racists, it fueled it. It fueled the fire that was simmering, and it just absolutely gaslighted the whole thing. And it basically gave free rein. People thought if the most powerful man in the world, the leader of our nation, can say this, you know what? All the racism that was already there, it's going to be a free-for-all. It's open season. So it was almost in some ways a green light to start, instead of just thinking about the racism, now acting it out. And that's what we saw being exacerbated with COVID-19. I think there was a lot of fear as well with immigrants in America. You know, I don't need to tell you, I think the world knows that America has a history, a long history of racism, from Native Americans having this land stolen to slaves being brought over to this country. And now even with Asian American immigrants, the Chinese, when they came here, I mean, they were always marginalized, made fun of, and we're constantly seen in stereotypical roles. So in closing, not one particular reason, but all of that kind of, you know, with COVID-19, people staying at home just kind of came all together and just exploded onto the scenes. And Asians have always been easy targets, so now it's open season. Obviously, authorities in many areas, many jurisdictions, I personally feel like, and the advocates I talk to feel like, they were caught with their pants down. They've never dealt with this at such a large scale. And when it comes to hate crimes, right, I know we're going to talk about that, but there is no one blanket hate crime law in every single state. In fact, in the US, not every state even has a hate crime law that you can charge to really go after this and to really stop this potentially.
And it's not just a matter of stopping or preventing future incidents, of course, but it's really, I mean, what happens to the victims? You know, they're going to have to live with this for the rest of their lives, and they're going to have to be able to process the kind of abuse that they've been receiving. And it's not just physical violence, but of course, there's also a growing number of instances where there were verbal abuse, as you mentioned, Jonathan, and almost 1/3 of Asian Americans surveyed last year, just 3 months into the pandemic, said that they'd been at the receiving end of such racial slurs or ridicule since COVID-19 broke out. And Dr. Sherry, all of these things, physical violence, verbal slurs, how does this really affect the psychology of the victim, and what can be done to really support them?
So when I think about what the Asian American experience is like right now, I think two key words come to me. It's invisibility. Invisibility, recognizing how much racism affects us, that we are people of color, and that this racism has been longstanding. It is not new for us. And isolation. We are isolated because we have not been seen as people of color. You know, Asian Americans have historically been treated in a very colorblind way, and that is because of the model minority myth, which emerged in the 1960s to really compare us to the Black community, to paint us into an image of success. And that really has hurt us a lot, because it means it doesn't show our pain, it doesn't show our suffering, it doesn't show our need for resources, and then it also against other communities of color. And so our suffering then is not on the same level of suffering, right, as other communities of color. And so we are very much invisible. And then because we're not seen as people of color, our people of color siblings, right, our Black, Indigenous people of color siblings, don't really see us as one of them. So it's very isolating. And so we're isolated, we're invisible, and yet we are hyper visible when it comes to being targeted by attacks. And so if I think about what we need to do, we actually need to create spaces and infrastructures for people to feel safe, safe enough to actually report hate crimes. The influx in numbers we're seeing in hate crimes, we're seeing it in some ways because people finally feel safe enough to report their experiences. That doesn't mean they weren't happening before. There just wasn't that support to give it that name. There wasn't a way to be able to report it and know what happens afterwards. And so I think what's really, really important is that for all of us, and especially for leaders, we have to create an infrastructure where people can hold a perpetrator accountable, that there can be consequences, and that we can support victims, that we hear their stories, we hear their experiences, and that actually we create change rather than, I'm sorry this happened to you, and that's it, because it will continue to keep happening unless we really take a very strong stance against anti-Asian racism.
And Jonathan, what are you and community leaders hoping to see from authorities? What are some important steps or changes you would like to see in American society?
Yeah, I think it's what I'm hearing, especially from advocates who are trying to work with the law enforcement community. You know, the hate crime is the only crime that you need to prove motive before charging. And that's, somebody needs to say an Asian racial slur or talk about somebody's, ethnicity or sexual orientation and attack them before you can even charge them with a hate crime. So a lot of the advocates I'm talking to, they want to see prosecutors have more discussions about that, to open that up, to figure out ways to somehow try to change that burden of proof to really charge in hate crime, and to also find other ways to charge these potential hate crimes that may be fueled by somebody's race, somebody being targeted because of their race, going harder after those as well. And at the end of the day, because Asian Americans, again, being called the model minority, a lot of these protests here in Seattle over the weekend with Asian Americans, I've never seen this many take to the streets in my entire life. And I was just stunned. And I think law enforcement was stunned as well, because there's this model minority myth that Asians don't cause any trouble. They're quiet. They stay to themselves. And now that they're finally coming out, I think it's getting the attention of law enforcement. And now these conversations with activists, community leaders who want to mobilize, form multi-ethnic coalitions. They also want to work very closely with law enforcement to say, come on, come into our communities, monitor our communities, look out for us. The Asian American community right now is starting to realize we need to learn from other communities that have been through this before. And I think the criticism for a lot of Asian Americans is Asian Americans have benefited off the backs of the civil rights movement. But now that it's happening to them, now that they're being victimized, it's gotten their attention.
Well, this is where we're going to have to end the interview today. But that was Jonathan Choe, crime and justice reporter for KOMO News, and Dr. Sherry C. Wang, Associate Professor of Counselling Psychology at Santa Clara University. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thanks for having us.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.